Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second lecture on the French Revolution. Remember, this is an exercise that is going to improve your note-taking skills and build your background knowledge on the French Revolution and supplement the reading you're doing in the book. Your notes should be a combination of the on-screen and voice-over material that I am delivering to you. Today we're going to finish talking about the estates. We'll talk about the Third Estate. Then we'll talk about the influence of the Enlightenment and the American revolutions, and we'll get into the financial crisis and talk a little bit about the Estates-General and the National Assembly. So the Third Estate, as you can see on your screen, is the estate that pays the most in taxes. This is the middle class and the poor of France. And the Third Estate had long worked under this obsolete tax code that placed the majority of the tax burden on its shoulders. With the heavy debt already a drain on their purse, the bad weather that Europe experienced in the 1780s caused widespread crop failures. These resulted in grain shortages, which pushed the price of bread, which was the main part of the French people's diet, too high. And most peasants could not afford to buy bread. So with people starving and going hungry, this proves to be another factor leading to the revolution. So the next slide talks about the Enlightenment, and we know that we had this idea of a social contract from Rousseau and new ideas about governing people from John Locke. The Enlightenment influenced both the American and the French revolutionaries. The Enlightenment was this period of intellectual discourse, debate, ferment that gives rise to a range of new theories about society, government philosophy, economics, and religion. The concepts of freedom or liberty, equality, and democracy are becoming popular through the writings of the thinkers of John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Thomas Paine, who writes Common Sense for the Americans. And Paine later, after the American Revolution, moves to France and becomes a revolutionary leader in France also. But the Enlightenment philosophers and writers attacked the aristocracy and the monarchy. And they drew most of their inspiration from this idea of the social contract, where if the monarchy and the aristocracy is not serving the people have the right to revolt and overthrow them. So the social contract is in the writings of both Locke and Rousseau, and it states that a ruler rules at the behest or with the consent of the people. If a ruler is unjust, according to the social contract, then the people have the right and the responsibility to replace that ruler. So the Enlightenment philosophers, or what we call philosophers, were chiefly responsible for the American Revolution, and after the French saw the Americans overthrow King George, they thought that they would be justified in having their own revolution as well. So during the American Revolution, France supported the colonists because they had been fighting against England for the last 100 years. So of course they're going to fight, they're going to aid the enemy to its enemy. But also the American Revolution gives the people of France these revolutionary ideals. And here you see in this picture Marquis de Lafayette, who helped George Washington. And then he returns to France, and he's a national hero in France also. So during the American Revolution, France strongly supported the colonies against England, mainly because England was their big enemy. The French government sent troops and ships and cash to the Americans. The French really couldn't afford to spend this money on a foreign war, and it yielded little in return for them. There were really no immediate benefits. The American people weren't able to pay them back for many years. But the ideals of the American Revolution and the Enlightenment principles that informed these ideals inspired men like the Marquis de Lafayette to rise up, and lead regiments of their own to fight in America. French soldiers in America ultimately got to see firsthand both the price of freedom and its benefits. The success of the colonies in winning their independence also proved that it was possible for the people to throw off the ropes, the shackles, the burdens placed upon it by an oppressive monarch or oppressive aristocratic regime. So these ideals and the French soldiers that were in America and helped the American soldiers defeat the British would go back to France and they would tell their friends, hey, if the Americans can do it, we can do it too. So the next issue is this financial crisis that France has. And we've heard in our book already about the finance minister, Jacques Necker. Because France had spent so much money on the American Revolution, they'd helped us and sent supplies to us and sent ammunition and weapons to us. So the expenditures that France made on the American Revolution, along with the huge sums of money the king was spending to maintain his lavish lifestyle at Versailles, makes France's already dire financial situation worse. And by the late 1780s, the government is close to bankruptcy. King Louis XVI's finance minister is a Swiss banker named Jacques Necker. And he knew that the poor had already been taxed as much as possible. So he knew that France needed to find a new source of revenue. And Necker proposes putting a tax on all property. And this essentially means that the first and second estates, the church and the nobles, would now have to pay taxes. Well, as you can imagine, neither of those groups want to pay taxes, and neither of these groups support this plan. The aristocracy sees their exemption from taxation as a birthright. They refuse to even discuss this issue. The church, which had grown wealthy on what we call tithes and property holdings. A tithe is when you automatically give part of your money to the church every week, every month, every year. So the church also rejects this idea of having to pay taxes on its lands. And since the first and second estates had balked at this plan, had kind of hesitated or kicked it back, Necker urges the king to call a meeting of the EstatesGeneral in order to get the property tax implemented. So here we go to the EstatesGeneral. And you can see in the picture, this is what the meeting looked like. Of course, this is a painting. This is before photography. And each estate has one vote in the EstatesGeneral, despite the fact that the first and second estates only represent 3% of the population of France. So the third estate, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the poor are the greatest percent of France. They're 97% of France, and they're paying all the taxes. So, but since the first two estates always voted together, if the third estate disagreed with them, there's little it can do because it only has one vote. So the nobles and the clergy have a vested interest in keeping the vote together. And they usually join together and they outvote the third estate, even though the third estate is 97% of the population. So the EstatesGeneral convenes in Versailles in May of 1789. The first and second estates have about 300 delegates each, and the third estate has about 600 delegates. There's a controversy, arguments over the voting almost immediately, as the third estate demands that rather than having one vote per estate, each delegate is given a vote. And this would have allowed the third estate to have the opportunity to gain a majority and win the voting. But the king rejects this proposal, of course, because he's got to help out his buddies in the clergy and the nobles. So we now go to the National Assembly, which basically is the third estate. After weeks and weeks of frustrating debating over the voting, the third estate declares themselves the National Assembly, and they claim they're France's true representative body. They essentially kick out the other estates, but they do invite them to come and join them. Some members of the clergy and the aristocracy do so, but the vast majority do not. And so this National Assembly is inspired by Abbé Sieyès, who had earlier published a pamphlet that proclaimed that the third estate and the nation were one. So on June 17th, 1789, the National Assembly is formed. This is the third estate's government, and they recognize it as the true government of the people of France. So this is a big, important step towards revolution, because the third estate is no longer recognizing the authority of the king or the Estates-General. So I want to talk a little bit about this picture next. And this is this cartoon is called The Third Estate Awakens. If you think back to the earlier cartoon, what is the Third Estate about to do? And you can see that in the background, that is the Bastille, which is a combination fort and armory and prison, where king's soldiers keep all their weapons and prisoners, enemies of the state. And you can see that the king and the clergy are both reacting in horror as the Third Estate wakes up and grabs weapons, and I think we all know what happens next. So, this, of course, is all leading up to a confrontation with the king, and this is King Louis XVI, and King Louis essentially orders the Third Estate not locked out of their meeting hall. So, he continues to insist that the estates meet separately and that the National Assembly be totally disbanded. Now, the National Assembly responds to this by moving to a nearby tennis court, and they promise not to leave until France has a new constitution. This tennis court oath, as it's called, gains the assembly popularity among the working class and the poor, and they even drew in or attracted some of the open-minded clergy and nobles to their side as well. So in this picture you see the artist Jacques Louis David's depiction of the tennis court oath, and this is an indoor tennis court at the Palace of Versailles. You can see it's got a huge room with a high ceiling. People are looking in from the ceilings, from the windows. The windows are letting in the light. You can see the speaker in the middle. This is just one of the rooms, one of the many rooms in the Palace of Versailles, which is huge and beautiful. On June 27th, the king reverses his position, and he orders the first two estates to join the National Assembly. He also calls the French troops into Paris to kind of keep a lid on the volatile situation. He does not want things to get out of control. He does not want riots. He does not want blood in the streets. The king wants to contain this situation and preserve his power, preserve the power of the nobles, and preserve the power of the clergy. However, with 97% of the population behind them, what do you think the Third Estate is going to do? We will talk about that next in the third lecture. We'll begin with the storming of the Bastille and talk about Bastille Day. Meanwhile, I hope you took some good notes. Feel free to rewatch this video, revise your notes, get into the habit of looking at your notes every day, 10 to 15 minutes a day, just reviewing them, looking at the dates, maybe trying to do a timeline, maybe doing a vocabulary foldable from the book about words you're not sure of or words you think will be tested on, words and concepts. And thank you very much for listening. Have a good night.